Now that you have your resources, now that you've gone to the library, you found a book source, you've printed some resources off of the internet, it's time to do probably the hardest part of this research paper, and that is taking the notes. The reason it's one of the hardest things to do for the research paper is because if you don't know how to approach taking notes, this process can be incredibly time-consuming and incredibly frustrating. So hopefully, before you go to take your notes, you'll look at some of the tips that we're about to give you, and this process should be a lot smoother. Hopefully, by this point, you're armed with your resources. You have to have a book resource for this assignment, so hopefully you're armed with that. Hopefully, you've also printed off some articles that you've gotten off of the internet. I highly recommend printing off the articles. It's always good to keep your resources close at hand because in the writing process, if you're halfway through your paper and you happen to remember some information that you read and you'd like to go back and find that information, if you have it printed off, it's much easier to find. So now that you're armed with these resources, the first thing you need to do is work with your note cards. Everyone should have some 3.5 by 5 note cards like these. Hopefully they're lined. And the first thing you need to do is take one resource and create a source card for it. Now, a source card just lists all of the important information about your source, such as who wrote the article or the book that you're about to research. Where can I find this article or book once I'm done with the researching process? This is information that you need to write down. It's also information that is important on your Works Cited page, and so it's best to get this information now before you have to give the book or the article back to the library. In order to make a source card, the best way to go about making a source card is actually turning to the research guide that all of your teachers have, and that actually has some copies in the library. This research gives you a lot of information about how to make source cards and how to make note cards. I don't really want to step-by-step tell you how to create a source card on this video for a couple of reasons. One, the MLA format, which is the format that you're supposed to research, it tends to change every once in a while. And so with an MLA format, the best thing to do is to look up how to write a source card every time you need to make one. That gets you in the habit of looking up information, and it also gets you in the habit of looking up the most current information. I would honestly hate to tell you how to create a source card and then 6 months later that information be out of date. But page 11 of the Putnam City Research Guide gives you details on how to make a source card, and your teachers have this information and Ms. DeFair has this information, so it should be very easy for you to track down and copy. For the first resource, we actually have our book out, and I've already made a source card for this book. I've included the author of the book, the press company that published the book, the year that the book was published, and the fact that it's a print source. It's very important to include when you're making an MLA source card. If you'll also notice in the top right-hand corner of this source card, I wrote the number 1, and that's because this is the first source that we're going to be using. It's very, very important to keep your sources numbered. It helps you stay organized, and the more organized you can be when doing this process, the easier it comes later on when you have to type this. So now that we have our source card, it's time to actually do the one thing that most students hate doing. You have to read the book and get some notes from it and get some information. Generally, whenever this process starts, a student will grab the book from the library. I grabbed a book about George Washington, and it's time to start looking for information about George Washington. And most students will start at the beginning of the book, at page 1, and they'll start reading. And they'll get maybe a couple of pages into it, and they'll get frustrated, and they'll quit. Generally, because the information that they're trying to find out about George Washington isn't in the first couple of pages. And the thought of reading this whole book before Christmas break and before the research paper is due seems very overwhelming. That's really not the best way to approach reading this. Remember the research questions that you had to generate before you came into the library. If you look at those research questions, those will greatly help you determine what information you need to find. For example, for George Washington, one of his greatest achievements was his role in building our country. So that's the information I want to look for. I really don't care that George Washington's parents came to America in 1729, and that's what chapter 1 of this book talks about. So I really don't want to read chapter 1. I want to find out about George and where his inspiration for joining the Continental Congress came to. So I'm going to go to the back in the index section. All biographies will have this sort of index in the back. And this sort of index details where important information about this person can be found on what pages. I actually want to look for George's involvement in the Continental Congress. So I scroll down the index to find Continental Congress, and I find that I need to go to page 116. When I go to page 116, then I can start finding information about George Washington's role in the Continental Congress. And that's what I want, because that's what my research questions ask about, not about his early life. So now I'm on the right page to research, and I can skip those early pages that just really don't mean anything. Once I've started reading, and I've found some really good information to use, that's some information to put on a note card. But there's actually a very strict process on how you put the information into a note card, and that's what we're going to go over. First off, if you have your information about George Washington or about whatever person you've decided to research and you want to put the information on a note card, you have your note card out, use the lined section, please. It's much, much easier. And go ahead and just write the sentence from the book straight to the note card. Make sure you use quotation marks. That's incredibly important because you don't want to mistake this quote for a paraphrase. So write down your information about George. And I'm going to be very sneaky. But once you have all of this information in the quotation mark, leave it there. Also, to help you out, put a Q right here. A Q stands for quote, and that's just another visual clue that what you have on this note card is a quote. If you decide you don't want to write a whole quote of a sentence down like I just tried to cheat and do, and you would rather just paraphrase it, you can absolutely do that. Just instead of writing a Q, write down a P for paraphrase. That way you know that the information on there is paraphrased and not original. This really helps greatly whenever you're trying to avoid plagiarizing or making sure that you have the right quote. Now after you're done with that, the next thing you need to do is write down the page number where this came from. We're using a book source, and we were on page 116 reading about George Washington and his role in the Continental Congress. So page 116 goes down here at the bottom right-hand corner of the page. Now, whenever we were reading about George Washington's role in the Continental Convention, I want to make sure that I know what this note card is about. Because by the time you're done with this process and you've gone through all 4 of your sources and you have note cards for all 4 of your sources, you're going to have note cards everywhere. So it's very, very good to actually head and put a heading on your note cards to know exactly what each note card is talking about. This actually helps you organize your paper, and it makes writing much easier. So since we were talking about Washington's role in the Continental Convention, my heading is going to be Continental Convention. This way, all I have to do is look at the top of the note card and see exactly what this quote is about. Whenever it comes time to write, I want to make sure that I get all of the note cards together. After this, I need to put down where this quote came from. That's where the numbers are very important. If you remember on the source card I made for George Washington, I put a 1 on this book source. So since this note about George Washington came from my book source number 1, put a number 1 in the corner of your note card. This will also help you organize. When it comes time to write your paper and you need to put a quote in your research paper, you'll need to be able to refer back to that quote and know how to properly cite that quote within your paper. The best way to do that is to have this one here. And this is what the note card would look like on a chalkboard, but this is actually what the note card would look like once you're done completing it. Most of your note cards will look just like this. They'll have some sort of heading, they'll have your source number, and they'll have your information. Now, the whole process of taking notes and note cards works for any type of source that you have. We just did book sources for this video, but for your web article, you do the same process. You read the information, and then you put the notes on the note card. If you have any questions, all of the teachers will be there to help you, and the librarians, if you're in the library, also have this information as well.